The room smelled of beeswax and old paper. That was what Constance Fenwick noticed first, standing at the edge of Mr. Donkou Haverstock's drawing room on the morning of the settlement signing, holding a glass of water she had not asked for and could not drink. The chairs had been arranged in a horseshoe around the mahogany writing table. At the table sat Mr. Cuff, Aldous Pemberton, and beside him Lady Haverstock in dove-grey silk, and at the end of the room near the window, Gideon Staverton, Earl of Staverton, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his dark eyes fixed on the middle distance, as though the proceedings had not quite earned his attention. Constance had not expected him there. She had not expected to be there herself. Agnes Whitmore had pressed her to come, and Constance, who owed Agnes more than she could name, had not found a convincing reason to refuse. Mr. Cadiz Croft, the clerk from Messrs. Aldgate and Sons, had spread the settlement documents across the table in 3 neat stacks. He was a small man with careful hands and a habit of clearing his throat before a sentence. He wished to be heard precisely. He cleared it once now, and Constance felt her own throat tighten in answer. "The matter of signature, Mr. Rock," Croft said, and his voice was perfectly procedurally calm, "requires one clarification before we proceed." He lifted a single page from the leftmost stack. He held it so the room could see it was a document of considerable age, its ink faded to brown at the margins. "Mr. Pemberton, your wife signed nothing." The room was still for a full 3 seconds before it was not still at all. To understand what happened in those 3 seconds and in every hour that came before them, one must go back to a November 5 years earlier, when Constance Fenwick had been 21 years old and had believed, the way the young believe things, that a mistake made quickly could be corrected just as quickly, if only one was patient enough to wait. She had married Aldous Pemberton in the autumn of her 21st year in a small church in Wiltshire, with her father's solicitor as witness and her father's debts as dowry. It had not been a love match. She had understood that at the time, and she had not reproached herself for choosing stability over sentiment. She had been a sensible girl, her father's daughter, in every respect that mattered. And Pemberton had been affable and financially comfortable, and had seemed at the time to want her. What she had not understood was that Pemberton's comfort depended on her father's estate passing to him through the marriage, and that once the estate had been assessed and found to be considerably less than promised, the nature of his interest in her changed with a speed that left her breathless. By the spring of her 22nd year, she was living in the house of her aunt in Bath. By summer, a solicitor had arrived with a packet of papers and an explanation she had not quite been able to follow. The marriage, Pemberton's man had said, had been dissolved. She need only sign here and here, and the thing was done. She had signed, or she had believed she had signed. The papers had been placed before her quickly, the man's hand covering half the text with a patient efficiency that she had later understood was deliberate. He had indicated where she should write her name, and she had written it, and the papers had been gathered and sealed before she had finished reading the sentence above her name. She had pressed the pen to the page in the belief that she was ending something that had, in truth, already ended, without her participation. The thing was already over, she had believed, and she was only marking the fact. That was what had made it easy. She had put the original marriage certificate in the writing box that afternoon and turned the key. Because she had not been able to bring herself to treat a legal document carelessly, even a document whose purpose she hoped never to have occasion to revisit. That was her father's training, perhaps, or simply her own instinct that things should be kept where they could be found, against the possibility that someone someday might need to find them. She heard nothing further from Pemberton for 4 years, which she had taken, in the silence of someone who has been given no reason to investigate, as a kind of answer, and she had come to London the previous autumn, at Agnes Whitmore's invitation. Agnes had known her father, and had heard of her situation, and had written a letter so straightforwardly kind that Constance had wept over it for an hour before packing her one good trunk. She lived now in Agnes's house in Portman Street, in a room with a northeast-facing window and a view of the neighbor's garden wall. She had a small income from the last of her father's funds, carefully managed. She had Agnes, who was warm and sharp-tongued, and entirely unimpressed by Constance's habit of refusing to want anything. She had not expected, when Agnes brought her to the Haverstock ball in the middle of January, to encounter Pemberton on the other side of the room, looking sleeker and more prosperous than she remembered. Standing at the elbow of Lady Haverstock and bending his head toward her in the attentive manner of a man who has recently learned to apply charm as a professional instrument. She had not expected the Earl of Staverton either, but she was less undone by him because she had at least seen him before. He had come twice to Agnes's house for supper, and both times had said little, and looked at the table, and asked Agnes questions about her late husband's properties, with the focused interest of a man accustomed to conducting interviews by making them seem like conversation. Constance had watched him do it, and had thought that he was either very intelligent or very lonely, and had not been able to decide which. She had decided finally that the distinction did not much matter, because both explanations produced the same quality of attention, and it was the attention, rather than its source, that she had found herself noticing. At the ball he stood near the terrace doors in his navy coat, one hand in his pocket, and he did not look at the dancing. The room was brilliant with candlelight, the chandelier above the central floor scattering light across 200 silk gowns and the white powder-bright faces of women who had dressed for exactly this kind of scrutiny. Music came from somewhere behind the long curtains, a country dance proceeding with the ordered gaiety of a thing that has been arranged to look spontaneous. Constance stood at Agnes's side and watched it, with the practiced composure of a woman who has made her peace with being the plainest object in a glittering room. He looked once across the room, and his gaze passed over Pemberton and came to rest briefly on Constance, and then moved on. It was not the looking of a man who found her arresting. It was the looking of a man who was cataloguing the room for reasons of his own, and had found something in his catalogue that he intended to return to. Lady Haverstock had arranged her daughter Cecily beside Pemberton with the ease of long practice, the way one positions a vase before a window for the best effect. Cecily Haverstock was 22, fair-haired, pretty in the precise manner her mother had cultivated, and wore an expression of pleasant compliance that Constance recognized, with a pang she chose not to examine, as the expression of a young woman who has been told repeatedly that her opinions need not trouble her. That evening, near the supper-room, Constance found herself close enough to Lady Haverstock and Cecily to hear what was not intended for her hearing. "You will ignore her entirely," Lady Haverstock said to her daughter, her voice a velvet murmur that her fan did not quite cover. "She is nobody now, a discarded wife with nothing to recommend her, clinging to Agnes's goodwill. She has no claim on anything or anyone, and the sooner she understands that, the better for everyone." Cecily nodded, without expression. She had learned, Constance suspected, to nod. Constance walked past them and said nothing, and her hands were entirely steady, which was the only achievement of the evening she allowed herself to be proud of. The Earl of Staverton was at the punch table when she reached it. He did not move to accommodate her, and he did not move away, which she had come to understand was his mode of coexistence with people, a perfect and considered stillness that gave nothing and demanded nothing. She poured her own cup and started to step back, and he said very quietly, "How long have you known Pemberton?" She looked at him. His face was composed, dark eyes, level, the gray at his temples catching the candlelight. "Long enough," she said. "That is not an answer." "No," she agreed. "It is not." He looked at her for another moment, the particular quality of his attention unchanged, and then he inclined his head once, the smallest possible acknowledgement, and she went back to Agnes. The fortnight that followed had the texture of a dream from which one cannot quite wake, not because it was pleasant, but because each day arrived with the sense that something was developing at a rate slightly faster than she could track. Pemberton sent her a letter the morning after the ball. She read it standing in the hall, still in her morning wrapper, and it was 3 paragraphs of affable prose that circled toward a single central request. She was to keep to herself the fact of their former acquaintance, and in exchange he would arrange a sum, quarterly, discreet, more than adequate for her situation, He used the word situation 3 times. He did not use the word marriage. Once she read it a second time. She read it a third time. Then she put it in the locked writing box on her writing table, the one that also contained the original marriage certificate she had carried from Wiltshire and never quite brought herself to burn. She did not write back. 3 days after putting Pemberton's letter in the writing box, she had an encounter in the park that told her, more clearly than the letter had, how seriously Pemberton regarded the matter. She was sitting on a bench near the fountain at the south end of the park, allowing Agnes's spaniel to investigate the mud at the path's edge, when a man she did not recognize approached and sat on the bench beside her without being invited to do so. He was well-dressed, in a bland, deliberate way, the kind of well-dressed that wished to be neither memorable nor shabby. And he set his hat on his knee and said that Mr. Pemberton had asked him to convey a revised offer in light of Miss Fenwick's failure to respond to the first communication. Constance looked at the spaniel. The spaniel was still occupied with the mud. "What is the revised offer?" she said. The man named a sum that was nearly double the first. He said, "Mr. and—" Pemberton was anxious to resolve the matter before the settlement signing, and wished to cause her no inconvenience, and hoped she would understand that her cooperation was in everyone's best interests. "Tell Mr. Prate, Pemberton," Constance said, "that I have received no communication from him, that I have nothing to settle." She picked up the spaniel's lead. "Good morning." She was on the far path, moving toward the gate at the north end of the park, when she became aware that the Earl of Staverton had been standing at the gate for some time watching. He was in his overcoat, his hands in his pockets, and the light was the particular flat white of a February morning that does not commit to any specific promise, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not yet learned to read. He fell into step beside her. When she reached the gate, he did not announce himself. He simply appeared at her left shoulder with the unhurried certainty of a man who never doubted his welcome, and walked in silence long enough that she had decided he intended to say nothing when he said, "He sent someone." "Yes," she said. "You refused." "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. The street opened ahead of them into the familiar gray of Portman Square. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "Nothing. I was not his audience." He paused. "Walk back to your friend's house. Do not go to Pemberton alone." Then he left her at the corner, back along the street with the same unhurried stride, and she stood in the cold with the spaniel sitting on her feet, and the strange sensation that something had shifted, tilted by a degree she could not measure. 2 evenings later, Agnes had received him for supper again, and this time the conversation had found a different quality than it had before, less the structured inquiry of a man conducting an interview, and more the careful exchange of two people who are deciding, in the space between sentences, how much to trust each other. He had asked her directly whether she had kept any documentation from the dissolution proceedings. She had said that she had not, because she had not been in the habit, at 22, of retaining correspondence from solicitors who arrived and departed in the space of an afternoon. She had said this calmly, and he had received it with a nod. And then he had said, "Did you sign anything?" She had thought about it with more care than she had given it in years. "I signed something," she said. "I cannot be certain what it was." The solicitor covered most of the text. Staverton set down his wine-glass with a precision she was beginning to understand was not fastidiousness, but something else, a deliberate steadiness applied to things that might otherwise feel unsteady. "That is useful," he said. "It does not feel useful. Most useful things do not, from the inside." She had looked at him and almost asked the question directly, which was something she had not done with him before. What stopped her was not reticence, but the sense that the question would close something before it was ready to be closed. It was Agnes who told her, later that evening over the fire, about the matter of the Staverton estate documents. The previous Earl, Gideon's father, had trusted his principal solicitor for 30 years. The man had been taking fees from the estate for most of that time, recording them in the accounts as legitimate expenses, forging the late Earl's signature on instruments of authority, the latter had never seen. By the time Gideon inherited the title and discovered the extent of it, the practice had been running for 17 years. The sum was not recoverable. The solicitor had been dismissed and publicly disgraced, which was the only form of remedy the law at that time offered with any reliability. What it had left behind in the new Earl, Agnes said, was not bitterness exactly. It was something colder and more useful than bitterness. It was a capacity to read a document and know immediately what was not in it, to see the negative space in a signature and understand what should have been there. Constance sat with this for a long moment. "He noticed something," she said. "He noticed several things," Agnes said, with the dry brevity of a woman who has known a man since he was in short coats. "He has written to Messrs. Aldgate and Sons. He asked me not to tell you, which is why I am telling you." The settlement signing had been arranged for the first week of February, at the Haverstock House in Grosvenor Square. Constance had had no intention of attending. The invitation, if the word could be applied to Agnes's quiet insistence that she come and not hide in Portman Street while her life was being decided in another room, had arrived 2 days before, and Constance had argued against it until she ran out of argument. She dressed that morning with the careful attention she gave to anything she expected to be difficult. The gray spencer had been pressed the evening before, the white muslin shaken out and smoothed. Her hair was simply dressed, and the small scar at her left temple, the one she had stopped thinking about years ago, caught the mirror light for a moment, before she looked away. She was 26 years old. She had been 21 when she married, and 22 when she was told it was over, and she had spent the 4 years between then and now learning to need very little, which was a useful thing to learn, and an exhausting way to live. Agnes handed her gloves at the door and said, only, "Hold your ground." It was the most and least comfort she could have offered, and Constance received it with the equanimity of someone who has learned that comfort and clarity are sometimes the same thing. She stood near the back of the room when they arrived, in her gray spencer and her white muslin, holding a glass of water she had not asked for, and watching Pemberton arrange his cuffs with the pleasured ease of a man who believed the morning would go entirely according to his plans. Lady Haverstock sat beside him like a woman who has not yet been told that weather has its own intentions. She wore diamonds, very fine ones, and the expression of someone for whom the acquisition of a son-in-law of comfortable income was not a social triumph so much as the correction of an oversight. She had arranged Cecily at the far end of the table, beside the window where the girl sat with her hands folded and her eyes on the tablecloth, and her expression of agreeable compliance stretched to something that almost showed its seams. Constance looked once at Lord Staverton, still near the window, as though he had not moved from every room she had seen him in, and his dark eyes met hers for 1 second, and then moved away. "The document is entirely in order," Pemberton said to Mr. Croft, "not as a question. We can proceed." Mr. Croft cleared his throat. "Mr. Pemberton," Lady Haverstock said in the tone of a woman accustoming herself to using his name. "The clerk has something to say. It is merely a procedural note," Pemberton said. He glanced very briefly at Constance, and what crossed his face was something that had worn the costume of a smile. For so long it had forgotten it was not one. We need not be detained by a woman with no claim. The room received this in a particular species of silence. Mr. Croft's pen did not move. "The dissolution," Pemberton continued, his voice acquiring the careful patience of a man repeating himself for an audience he considers slow, was executed in full. The papers were properly drawn. There is nothing further to discuss. "Pemberton," Mr. Croft said, and the quiet of his voice was the quiet of a man who has practiced delivering difficult truths without drama. He lifted the page from the leftmost stack. He held it so the table could see it, and then so the room could see it. "Your wife signed nothing." What the room did in the seconds that followed was not easy to describe, because the room contained 20 people and each of them received the sentence differently, and the receiving happened in complete silence so that all of it was visible. Lady Haverstock's face did not change, because her face was of the kind that had been trained not to change, but her hand, resting on the table, went very still in a way that was different from composure. It was the stillness of a woman who has, in the space of a breath, recalculated the last 2 months and found the arithmetic does not hold. Pemberton's expression passed through several states in fast succession, the way water passes through the stages before it boils. There was something almost childlike in the speed of it, the passing of the comfortable assumption that the thing was settled, the hitting of the fact that it was not, and never had been. Mr. B. Haverstock, who had said almost nothing for the entire morning, lowered his pen to the table and looked at it, and then looked at Pemberton and said with the measured neutrality of a man who has employed solicitors for 30 years, "Pemberton." That single syllable, in that room with that weight behind it, accomplished more than any speech would have. Cecily, at the far end of the table, raised her eyes from the tablecloth and looked at her mother with an expression that was not the agreement of the trained but the waking of the untrained, and whatever she saw in her mother's stillness seemed to tell her something she had not been told before. "The signature on the dissolution document," Mr. Croft continued in the same procedural calm, "is not Miss Fenwick's signature. The formation of the letters is inconsistent with the signature on the original marriage certificate." He set the original certificate on the table. Constance did not need to ask where it had come from. She had locked it in the writing box. She had left the writing box in her room at Agnes's house. She looked at Agnes, who met her gaze with the equanimity of a woman who has decided that the ends were sufficient justification for the means. "There was no dissolution," Mr. Croft said. He looked up at Pemberton, and his expression was not unkind, only precise. "There is no second marriage to contract, Mr. Pemberton. You are already married. The lady to whom you are married is in this room." No one looked at Pemberton then. They looked at Constance. She was standing exactly as she had been standing when she entered the room, with the glass of water in her hand, and her back straight, and the gray spencer lying neat against her gown. She had not moved. She did not move. Now, in the particular pressure of 20 pairs of eyes, she stood exactly still, the way something stands still when it has learned that stillness is the only dignity available. It was in that stillness that Gideon Staverton crossed the room. He did not hurry. He crossed the room with the same unhurried stride she had watched in the park, in Agnes's hall. In every space he moved through as though the world's pace were a matter entirely at his discretion. He came to stand beside her, and he turned to face the room, and the room rearranged itself to accommodate this as a fact. "She is my intended," he said, "and Pemberton will face the magistrate." The sentence landed in 12 words. It was not a speech. It did not require elaboration. It named her as chosen, and it named Pemberton's consequence. And it did both, with the clarity of a man who has spent a great deal of time understanding the legal weight of language and the social weight of silence. Lady Haverstock opened her mouth and closed it. She had prepared for a settlement signing, not for the architecture of the room, to rearrange itself around a woman in a gray spencer she had spent the better part of 2 months treating as furniture. "Lord Staverton," she said finally. "Lady Haverstock," he said, and his voice was perfectly, precisely courteous, the way a wall is courteous. It does not argue. It simply does not move. Pemberton said several things after that, in the rapid register of a man whose carefully arranged life is collapsing around his ears. He spoke of misunderstandings, of documents lost in the post, of the difficulty of conducting legal business at a distance. He appealed to Mr. Haverstock, who did not respond. He appealed to Lady Haverstock, who had the particular quality of stillness of a woman who has decided that the battle is already decided and is now occupied with calculating what comes next. None of the things Pemberton said found purchase. The room received each sentence in a silence that was not unkind, but was absolute, the silence of people who have understood that a man's credibility has, in the space of a single morning, ceased to function. Mr. Ree. Croft gathered his documents with the methodical care of a man who has witnessed worse and recorded it all. He said, to no one in particular and to everyone in the room, that Messrs. R.B. Aldgate and Sons would file notice of the fraudulent dissolution with the appropriate authority, and that the matter would proceed as the law directed. He then addressed Pemberton directly, in the same procedural calm he had used throughout the morning, and explained that the consequences would not be agreeable for his standing in the county, his standing in London, or his standing before any future solicitor he might wish to engage. He said it the way one states a fact that does not require embellishment. Constance stood exactly where she had been standing when Lord Staverton crossed the room to her. She had not moved. Her glass of water was still in her hand, still mostly full, and she looked at the room, and the room looked at her, and she met all of it with the same composed steadiness she had brought to the morning, which was not courage, exactly, but something that had grown in the space where courage had been required so often it had become habit. Lady Haverstock left with the compressed dignity of a woman accustomed to graceful retreats. Though the grace was slightly more effortful than usual, she did not look at Constance. She looked at Cecily, and what passed between them in that look was not punishing, only tired, the particular tiredness of a woman who has arranged too many lives without consulting the people living them. Cecily, as she was being guided from the room by her mother's hand at her elbow, turned in the doorway and looked at Constance. Her expression was not resentful. It was the expression of someone who has been told an interesting truth at some cost to themselves, and who has chosen in the space of a moment to be grateful for it, rather than not. "I did not know," Cecily said. And then, in a quieter voice, "I am glad it stopped." Constance looked at her for a moment, this girl who had been arranged like furniture for the better part of a season, and felt something that was not quite sympathy, but was near to it, and said, "So am I." Agnes drove her home in a hired carriage, and neither of them said much. Agnes had the gift, rare enough in the world, of knowing when silence was more comfortable than its alternative. The city moved past the carriage windows in the flat February light, and Constance watched it and thought of nothing in particular, which was either a sign of shock or a sign of peace, and she could not yet tell which. She went up to her room when they arrived at Portman Street. She sat for a long time at the writing table. The writing box was there, Agnes having arranged for its return, sitting on the corner of the table in its usual place. She opened it with the small brass key she kept on her watch chain. The marriage certificate was inside. She had looked at it only twice in 5 years, both times in the small hours when she could not sleep. She looked at it now, in the flat February afternoon light, coming through the northeast window, and for the first time she saw it not as evidence of a mistake, but as evidence of a fact. She was here. She had been here all along, carrying this with her, not burning it, not abandoning it, keeping it in the box with a careful precision she had not quite been able to explain to herself until now. She had kept it because she had known, in some part of herself too cautious to speak aloud, that the thing had not been settled, that something still needed to be named. If it would be of any comfort, and perhaps it is, there are those who choose to remain with a story all the way to the quiet parts. This one has more quiet left. Stay a little longer. The Earl of Staverton came to Portman Street 2 days later. Agnes received him in the sitting room, and then, with the transparent efficiency of a woman who has arranged this precise eventuality, discovered that she was needed in the kitchen and would be some time. He sat in the chair, across from Constance in his navy coat, his dark eyes finding her with the same precise attention she had learned to expect. "You knew," she said, "before Mr. Croft read the settlement. You had already established it." "I had established that the signature on the dissolution was not yours. Mr. Croft established the rest. How did you know to look?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the February wind moved through the garden, and the bare branches of Agnes's plane tree made a sound against the window glass. "Pemberton applied to me," he said, 4 months ago. He wanted a character reference for the Haverstock match, and in the course of the conversation, he mentioned a former attachment, briefly, and the way he mentioned it was the way men mention things they wish to be taken as settled, that are not yet settled. "I have heard that manner before," he paused. "I know what a forged signature looks like." She thought of what Agnes had told her of the solicitor and the 17 years, and the particular knowledge that leaves scars too smooth to see until you run your hand across them. "It cost you something," she said. "Yes," he said, not modestly, not evasively, just the fact of it, placed between them on the morning room air. "Lord Staverton," she said carefully, because she was a woman who had learned to move carefully in rooms where the ground was not yet established. "You said in the Haverstock house that I was your intended. I did. You said it in order to place me under the protection of your name. In the moment. I said it," he said, and his voice was the same level it always was. But there was something in the level now she had not heard before, something that was not restraint over nothing, because it was what I wished to be true. I said it rather than waiting for a better opportunity to ask, because the better opportunity had not arrived, and you were standing in the middle of a room full of people who had spent 2 months looking through you, and I did not wish to do the same. She looked at him, the gray at his temples, the jaw set steady, the dark eyes that had been cataloging rooms for reasons that had turned out, in the end, to be about her. "I am a woman of no fortune," she said. "I am technically still married to a man who is about to be publicly disgraced. The process of establishing my legal standing will take months. I come to this with nothing that any person of sense would consider advantageous." "Yes," he said, "I am aware of all of that. And none of it is a reason," he said, "to say something other than what I said." A long silence inhabited the room. Constance looked at her hands, at the writing box on the table, at the northeast window, and the bare gray February sky. Something that had been held at tension for a very long time was beginning very slowly to find a new shape. "I would," like she said at last, carefully, honestly, the way she had not been able to be honest about wanting anything for a long time. "To be asked." He stood up. He crossed to her chair and offered his hand. She looked at it, at the clean line of his palm. "Miss Fenwick," he said, her name in his voice the way a key sounds when it turns, "I am asking." She gave him her hand and did not take it back. The months that followed were not simple. They never are, when legal proceedings must unsnarl what dishonesty has tangled. Mr. Dean Pemberton's case was placed before the county magistrate in the spring, and the outcome, though Constance took no pleasure in it, was the outcome the law provided. A public censure, the forfeit of his license to practice as a gentleman of affairs in 2 counties, and a quiet removal from the society that had briefly regarded him as a suitable match for a baronet's daughter. He did not contest the original marriage. He could not. Mr. Croft's documentation was thorough. Constance's legal standing was established by mid-March, and if the process required her to attend 2 appointments with solicitors and to read more documents than she had read in the previous 5 years combined, she did so with a patience that was no longer the patience of someone enduring what cannot be changed, but the patience of someone managing what is already becoming what it needs to be. Lady Haverstock retreated from the season's principal entertainments for the remainder of the winter, which served her well. She was not destroyed, and no one had tried to destroy her. The social machinery that had sustained her confidence had simply encountered a fact it could not accommodate and had adjusted as such machinery eventually does, once the noise settled. By the following autumn, Cecily had been introduced to a young cavalry officer of modest rank and considerable character, and the match was made with very little engineering, and Agnes, who heard about it from a friend, reported that Cecily appeared for the first time to be making a decision of her own. Agnes, when told of the engagement, expressed no surprise. She expressed, in the dry economy of a woman who had arranged rather more of the situation than she had admitted to, satisfaction. The announcement was made quietly. The engagement was of the kind that does not require a great deal of public apparatus to sustain it, because its foundation is not social approval, but something older and less contingent than that. They were married in the first week of May, in a church in Mayfair, with Agnes as witness, and a small company of people whose goodwill was genuine rather than performed. The morning was clear, the particular clear light of an English spring, that does not quite know it has arrived. That evening, in the house in Berkeley Square that would now be Constance's home as well as his, she sat by the fire in the small sitting room off the library. The room had bookshelves on 3 sides, and a window that looked out toward the square, and a fire that had been burning since the afternoon, so that the room was warm with a particular warmth that is only warm when the cold has been real. She had brought very little. 1 good trunk, her books, the few small things from her father's house she had carried through 5 years and 3 rooms. Agnes had returned the writing box in the afternoon, with a note in Agnes's hand that said only, "Burn nothing," which was, Constance thought, advice she had finally been able to act on. The writing box sat on the small table beside her chair. She opened it. She took out the marriage certificate, the original one, and looked at it in the firelight, at the ink that had faded at the margins, at the signatures, hers, his, the witnesses, the date that had once seemed like a sentence and now seemed like only a record of something that had happened, neither more nor less than what it was. Gideon came in from the hall. He stood in the doorway for a moment, as he always stood in doorways, with that unhurried quality of a man who does not feel the need to announce himself, and looked at her in the firelight. The light made the gray at his temples look less like age and more like weather, something earned by being present in certain kinds of storms. "What are you doing?" he said. "Deciding whether to burn it," she said. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, and looked at the certificate with her. He did not take it from her. He looked at it the way he looked at every document, with the particular regard of a man who has learned that a piece of paper is not merely paper, that what is written on it, and what is absent from it, can determine the course of lives that never imagined being determined by ink. It is evidence, he said. Of what? That you were here, he said. That you carried it. That you did not let it be taken from you. She looked at him. In the firelight, his face was not composed, in the way it was composed in public. The jaw not set, the dark eyes not calibrating the room. He was simply present, looking at her, with the expression of a man who has stopped measuring the distance between where he is and where he wishes to be. She looked at the document for another moment. Then she folded it along its old creases and put it back in the writing box, and closed the lid outside. The square was quiet. Somewhere above the rooftops, the May sky had gone, the particular blue that comes after sunset, deep and still, the color of something that has finally arrived. The fire burned steadily. Her hand was in his, unheld and unannounced, simply there, as though it had always been there, as though the gesture were too ordinary to require comment. It was